Hi, Glenn. It's nice to talk to you again.
It is nice to have you on the Glenn Show. Glenn Loury here of Brown University and Blogging Heads and the Glenn Show. Harold, Pollack, my old friend. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. I teach social service administration at the University of Chicago. I'm a liberal health policy wonk, and that's probably all people need to know.
Harold of Chicago, of the University of Chicago, home of President Obama, and Harold, who I can recall, sent me a photograph from inside the signing ceremony of the Affordable Care Act. Mm-hmm. I remember that photo. You weren't exactly in the front row, Harold, but you were in the room, my man.
That is true. I was one of the people. I would say definitely one of the stage extras, sort of in the Rosencrantz and Guildenstern category. But
I say that to say that you are a player in the health policy arena, that you are a partisan, that you were a part of the team, maybe not exactly in the front row, but nevertheless. And now the Affordable Care Act has been upheld by the Supreme Court. And here we are to assess the implications of this historic development. Harold, set our agenda, please.
Well, by the way, I should say at the start, I don't speak for any team. So I am my own team, but I'm certainly one who has an allegiance to health reform and and of course it was a great relief.
Oh, okay, hold on. I'm sorry to stop you right there, but okay. Now you're your own team. You're not, now what does that mean? You don't have a paid position with the Obama campaign? Or does that mean, yeah, okay. Because my impression is that you give your left arm to see the president reelected, or something pretty close to that. Did I get that wrong?
Well, I strongly support the president, although I must say that I support the president because of the policies that he's supporting, and I think when people cover health reform in a sort of horse race way, I think that they sort of split my allegiance, because while I like the president just fine, this is a lot more important because of the 32 million people who are uninsured than it is because of what it's going to do in the Obama-Romney election campaign in November. So I would just add that qualifier. That
can I comment on that?
Yeah, sure.
Which is to say, it sounds like a spin move. This rhetorical construction that I've heard repeated almost verbatim by many people, even some not affiliated with the campaign, to the effect that this before the decision was handed down. The issue here is not whether or not the Supreme Court affirms Barack Obama's aspirations for re-election. The issue here is whether or not 35 million or 32 million or whatever, whether or not the moral crusade of expanding the welfare state and finally solidifying the social safety net, et cetera, et cetera. And when I hear that line, I agree that there are huge policy matters at stake. But of course, there are two sides to this argument, and the notion that this act's ratification by the court is somehow the dawning of a new era of social responsibility and collective responsibility in America, and whatever strikes me as a bit overblown, since it's a kind of 51-49 proposition politically, and since the real resolution will be at the ballot box and not with the Supreme Court. But in any case, yes, the horse race reporting and policy reporting are two different things. But when you say let's talk policy in that horse race, that feels a little bit like a horse race move to me, even if you don't intend it so.
Well, I understand why you say that, but I would have felt exactly the same way, first of all, about Hillary Clinton. In fact, I was an Obama partisan in 2008, but I remember at one point I wrote a piece in the New Republic called "Can We Forgive Each Other?" about the Obama-Clinton, how bitter it was getting between Obama and Clinton, and I basically said, look, whoever wins this thing, we're all going to work together with each other, because I told a story about how when I was canvassing, I met a guy who his family was holding a garage sale because he needed a liver transplant, and he was going medically bankrupt while he was waiting to qualify for Medicare. And and everybody who is involved in health policy has just met a lot of people who are really suffering because they're uninsured, or because they're insured but it turns out that their insurance doesn't work for them when they get really sick. And that is a lot deeper than Barack Obama or Hillary Clinton or anybody else. I mean, if you had to have me rank my preference orderings, and you said health reform is really successful, but Obama's a one-term president. Health reform dies, but Obama gets reelected. You know, that would be an easy choice for me, even though I like Obama a lot. You know, it's really not about the players.
I have a question. Why is it a moral issue that children be allowed to stay on their parents' health insurance policy until they reach some mid-20 age as opposed to an early 20 age? Why is that something that is important in terms of the historic sweep of the realization of public policy that can be, you know, regarded as morally just or right?
Well, I think it depends on who that kid is. Is it a moral issue that one of my students who's basically healthy has insurance through his mom or dad rather than through some other vehicle? That's one question. But if you look at the 19-year-old pediatric cancer patient who's going to get kicked off of their parents' insurance at age 19 and who needs help, it turns out to be important. And so a lot of the people that have been brought on through this particular provision are people, the first people to come on are basically people who are sick and who really have an important reason to come on. So there's other parts of the Affordable Care Act that are sort of more central to American social insurance than that one, but that one has helped a lot of people.
Suppose I enact a piece of social policy that helps 10 million people. Mm-hmm. Suppose 2 million of those cases are absolutely gut-wrenching and morally compelling, and suppose the other 8 million of those are, well, transfer programs to the middle class of one form or another with which we are very familiar, including farm policy and small business support and all the rest, engendered by a kind of politics with which we are very familiar, which involves amassing a set of interests that constitute 51% and then getting a public policy passed. What proportion of the Affordable Care Act is the former and what proportion is the latter? Do you understand my question?
I do understand. It's a little hard to answer that because there's an ex ante versus ex post aspect to social insurance. So if you look at the uninsured population right now, there's a lot of people who are economically disadvantaged who need to be on it, who would definitely fit within that category of people for whom we have a moral obligation. There's also another group of people, and I did a paper that calculated it's about 4 million out of, maybe 10% of the uninsured are people who have serious health problems and who are probably uninsurable within the individual and small group market. And I think they fit as well. So there's certainly a sizable group who are either economically or by health status, people we really need to help and people that we're failing to help now. And of course, there's another group of people who are regular people, at least at this moment in their life, don't fit neatly within either category. I certainly agree with you that there's a degree of politicking that has to go on that makes it very difficult to really focus narrowly on the people in greatest need. At least certainly in a sort of ex post sense, it's very hard to narrowly focus on those people because it's too small of a group. And in fact, one of the things that disgusts me about the American political process is that the uninsured who really are needy, they're a disorganized group. A lot of them are basically either they don't vote or they're basically firmly Democrats. They don't sort of match any political consultants' definition of the marginal voter, and they basically are marginalized in our politics and are kicked to the curb in a way that really is quite shameful.
Well, okay. I agree with you that disadvantaged people don't have a lot of political influence. Neither do children. Neither do future generations, for that matter. I mean, there are many people whose lives are going to be affected by the development of policy, but who don't have a say in how that policy gets developed. So that seems to be baked into the cake with any kind of public deliberative process.
Yeah, it's funny. In health insurance...
I don't know what the remedy... What's the remedy? I mean, homeless people or people who are intermittently employed or people who are low income in education or people who live in the backwaters and the margins of the society don't have megaphones to their mouths. What would you do about that?
Well,
although that's a side question from,
okay. But there's a couple of wrinkles in the health insurance area. One is
what country's politics, I'm sorry, just on the point of whether or not this is a shameful aspect of our politics or an unavoidable and inescapable aspect of anybody's politics, what country's politics do have homeless or the marginal or the intermittently employed or those who have yet to be born or those who are not yet of majority age having any sway over the development of public policies which materially affect their lives.
Well, I would say that
I'm not sure what your complaint is.
Well, every society has a complex political economy that that has some people that are marginalized. I must say we are really the only wealthy democracy where people get cancer and lose their homes. So in this particular domain, we have really functioned very poorly. And ironically, by the way, better for children and health insurance than for other things that interest children. Children are very cute and cuddly, and they're also very cheap to cover in terms of health insurance. So if you look at the Affordable Care Act, the easiest and first things that were done were to take care of issues involving children, which have been done. Right now, those have already been implemented, and they're having a beneficial effect because children are so easy. Because most children are quite healthy. The 52-year-old people with diabetes, there's a lot more of them, and they're a much tougher problem. But I certainly...
Yeah. Well, I guess a couple of points. One is that the social compact in which I recognize that someone's illness is actually my problem, and that they should be held harmless against the cost of that, at least within reason, so as not to have most of most of their assets dissipated by the need to cover their care. That understanding and that social compact is yet actually to be established in the United States, although we may yet get there.
By the way, I would like to see President Obama and many other people be more forthright about our moral obligations in this particular way.
Sure, and the reason that they're not, the reason that they, I would assume, not being more direct and forthright about that is that they don't think it would be politically viable to do so.
That's absolutely correct. And so we end up making arguments about how covering the uninsured will save us a lot of money in various ways, rather than we need to cover the uninsured to make sure that that people are treated with dignity, which is really what animates most of us who are involved in the debate.
Yeah. Okay. I was going to make a second point, but let's not digress.
Okay.
Let's talk about the Supreme Court's decision itself. I saw some of your early comments on that and was interested in your take, both about, the legal interpretation. Justice Roberts, he says that it's not constitutional to compel people to purchase insurance on threat of a penalty, but it is constitutional to levy a tax on people who wouldn't otherwise have covered themselves. And the 5-4 decision and so forth, not letting the Commerce Clause be interpreted as broadly as it might, but using the tax authority, this kind of thing. I wonder what your take is. And then also on, if you don't mind, the kind of political implications of the court's decision. I know that's not your first point, but it seems like it's something we should talk about.
Well, okay. Let me say a few things about the decision. I actually think it was it was a sign of relief for me. I was really expecting something more destructive. I must say I wrote a dyspeptic column about it in the New Republic right after it was published, not about this decision, but about the process. And I sent it off to my friend Jonathan Cohn, who's who's the pertinent editor there, and he said, "Boy, you're so negative." I think this.
Because you just won. Why aren't you happy?
and I'm, and this is, I breathe a sigh of relief, but I don't celebrate because this whole thing, the whole process, should never have gotten as far as it went. I really think this was an easy case, and that it reflected.
You mean on the law, it's an easy case? On the Commerce Clause, it's an easy case?
Well, I think first of all on the Commerce Clause, and secondly, this tax argument that was finally made has been around for a long time. I should say I'm not a legal expert, but almost all the legal experts, including people like Reagan's Solicitor General, etc., you can give a long list of Republicans who said this is not a hard case. And one of the sad things about our politics is the way that ideological polarization has just infected everything. And I think, in fact, it's interesting. I think Justice Roberts, this was a conservative ruling, and I think it was a conservative ruling in a couple of ways. It did narrow federal power, and we can talk about that in a minute. But he showed himself, I think, to be an institutional conservative and not an insurrectionist conservative. There's a Tea-Party strain that basically wants to burn down the House, and Justice Roberts is not that kind of a conservative. I think he quite rightly looked at the reputation of the court after Bush v. Gore and Citizens United, and the way that and sort of the way this thing percolated up to the Supreme Court with Democratic appointed judges upholding the law and Republican appointed judges overturning it or limiting it in one form or another. And he realized, a 5-4 decision of Republican-appointed justices that destroys the centerpiece of a Democratic presidency, that's just not something that the Supreme Court can do. And I think
you're quite sure that was his thinking, right?
Well, since I can hear since given my psychic powers, I suspect that was played a large role, and I think it should have played a large role, and I think he found a way to give everybody a little bit of something. In fact, a lot of liberals are very concerned about the Medicaid component of the decision, which basically made it optional for states to pick up the Medicaid expansion and health reform. I actually think the reasoning there is pretty specious in the Supreme Court ruling, but I actually think that in the long run it serves American democracy well. By
putting the conservative governors on the hot seat, that they have to actually now make an explicit decision to extend the Medicaid coverage, and so we can have a politics of that kind of policy debate play out at the state level.
Yeah, you look at a state like Texas, and they're being offered over the next from 2014 to 2019, they're being offered more than $50 billion in federal funds, for which they would have to put up $2.5 billion in return. And every healthcare provider and every state, every county government, every city government is just going to be desperate for this. And we've seen this before. We've seen this with racial segregation of healthcare after Medicare, and we've seen this also later during the Reagan and Bush 1 years, when a lot of the red states picked up some of the optional Medicaid expansions that Henry Waxman is identified with. And it's a put up or shut up moment where states really have to decide: are we going to do this? And if we do embrace this federal money, then I think I would rather do that than jam it down everyone's throats. I think that it is sort of an irony of this whole thing that we're just fighting tooth and nail with these red state governors to take a ton of money that's being provided by blue states. And
well, now, why would they not take it, Harold? Are they just that stupid? What do you think's going on? Maybe they have principled reasons for objecting to the expansion of federal power and the imposition of federal constraint, so much so that they're willing to pay in fiscal terms in order to avoid the imposition of federal dictate.
Well, I would say there's a couple of things.
Are they just stupid?
No, I don't think people are stupid. I think people are political actors with constituencies. But I think there's a couple of things going on here. I think one is a lot of them actually want the money. They just want to be able to inveigh against federal power and condemn the policies that while taking the money. And this forces them to actually endorse these policies or reject them. And I think for someone like Rick Perry, this is going to be a real dilemma. I also think that many of these states have a very tenuous commitment to the well-being of their poorest citizens. A lot of their poor citizens are African American or Latino, and that's not irrelevant when you're talking about a lot of these states. I think that the history of these policies is one in which there's a very deep there are very deep disagreements and very deep social divisions in these states.
Okay, so let me understand. Is it your understanding then that given this diversity of political and ideological sensibility in the electorates of the several states, that insofar as there are jurisdictions which don't share our enlightened liberal sensibilities about state responsibilities, then it is the appropriate role of the federal government to use its interstate transfer of funds to compel these unenlightened jurisdictions to adopt policies consistent with the sensibilities of those of us who live in the Northeast or on the West Coast of the country.
Sometimes it is, yeah. I mean, I think that it depends what those sensibilities are. But I think that...
So what Justice Roberts' decision in this particular case implies is that insofar as expanding Medicaid coverage in order to increase the reach of the safety net for health care, that's not a policy arena in which it's appropriate for the federal government to compel, on threat of withholding federal funds, the several states to follow a more progressive policy.
Yeah, he did limit that principle in a new way. Now, there's still mean, essentially he's saying you can use really strong carrots, but you can't use sticks. And so, and that's,
Okay.
and we'll have to see how this plays out, but I think that it will be a very interesting and in some ways a very fruitful and democratic discussion in these states where they say, you know, what do we really believe, and are we really willing to leave $50 billion on the table to express, you know, a conservative ideological perspective? That was the striking thing about the post-civil rights era was racial segregation of healthcare happened for the most part, you know, remarkably smoothly in states that bitterly opposed the Civil Rights Act and other aspects of the civil rights agenda. And then you look at a place like Jackson, Mississippi, and how they were willing to build and to support and do what had to be done to have racially integrated healthcare. Once they realized, you know, this is the only way that financially these facilities are going to be successful.
Yeah. No, I know that story has been much discussed of the implications of the provisions in the civil rights legislation that would threaten jurisdictions with loss of federal funds if they didn't integrate. And Tom Schelling the great economist, a former colleague of mine, used to talk all the time about how, you know, hospitals that had segregated wards or whatever, and that had very strong social customs against interracial mixing in health service delivery, were able to tell, you know, their attendant physicians and their patients and all the rest that, look, you know, we don't want to do this, but we don't really have any choice, and we don't go along. The feds will zap us, and that allowed for the overcoming of deeply entrenched opposition to this kind of social reform.
Yeah, and I think partly because there was a submerged level of ambivalence about racial segregation that was not socially acceptable to express, but that was there.
But the analogy with healthcare maybe is a little strained, isn't it? I mean, if the states had different welfare benefit levels for aid to families, needy families or whatever, as they do, I wouldn't have thought that compelling them all to rise to a high level would be a kind of imperative of social justice comparable to compelling them to forego racial integration, racial segregation.
I don't know about that. I mean, you look at a state like Texas where they have huge numbers of uninsured people. You know, there's definitely there are real issues of social justice going on there, and what they're really upset about in a lot of cases is not that they would have to bring on these new people who would be eligible in health reform, but that they actually would have to cover all of these people who are nominally eligible right now for various kinds of health care, but for whom the state government
haven't signed up.
And people haven't signed up in part because the state has designed structures that discourage people from signing up in one way or another, and they'd have to actually deal with that. By the way, let me say one reason why I'm not celebrating, which I didn't get to, which is I do think that critical time has been lost while we've been pursuing this, what I view as legally baseless legalist process. And I think that, you know, this bill is going to have a lot of problems. The implementation challenges are significant, and many of the states really, have basically not been able to move or have chosen not to move until either the case was resolved or until they sort of got a better beat on what the politics of healthcare reform is. And as a result, there's a whole series of deadlines that states are required to meet that most states are going to miss. And you listen to the critiques of judicial activism that conservatives generally offer, how it creates regulatory uncertainty and delay and distracts the attention of policymakers with all sorts of fruitless lawsuits. This is perfect.
Okay, I get the point.
I'll stop talking about it.
But let me just say, the court ruled in favor of the Affordable Care Act. So this is not an instance of judicial activism. And the process of the case going through courts is not judicial activism; it's judicial process. I mean, I don't know that there could have been any other coherent or sensible or legally respectable process other than to allow people who wanted to raise objections, states, to raise them and have the court, which it did so relatively expeditiously in less than 2 years, hear those cases and then come to something.
I think the lower court.
I don't know what you're talking about, judicial activism.
The lower court should
they should have just let the law go on without any challenge so that it could be quickly implemented, and the court process should have been stymied for that.
No, I think that the court should have rejected it at lower levels with arguments that were readily available. And I think that the fact that a lot of judges at lower levels made rulings that required the Supreme Court to deal with this, reflected ideological polarization, but did not really reflect the underlying legal merits here, and that this was a weak case that should have been addressed much more quickly. And many of the state attorneys general who signed on to it should have realized that this is not a strong case, and that it's essentially using the courts to try to undo what the political process.
But it was a strong case, Harold. It was decided by the narrowest of margins at the highest court level, and not on the grounds which the administration was mainly arguing. I mean, it wasn't a weak case.
I think this whole process is one of the best exhibits for legal realism that I've ever seen. Several people have said, how could the legal experts have gotten this so wrong? Because all the legal experts predicted that this was an easy case ex ante. And the answers that typically came back is the mistake that people made was that they really looked at the existing case law and precedent, and from that interpreted that this would be readily, easily addressed. And what they did not deal with was the idea that once the Republican Party in lockstep, really pushed this constitutional claim and really backed away from its own individual mandate to suddenly decide that this was an affront to the Constitution, that a lot of Republican-appointed judges would suddenly find this more compelling than they would have 5 years ago, and I just think that an attitude of great cynicism towards many of those decisions is entirely warranted, and the fact that I agree with you that there are. By the way, I think one of the things that's silly is some people on the left were almost hoping that this would be overturned because they were saying, well, if you couldn't have the individual mandate, you would have a single payer as the alternative, which A, is politically impossible, but B, I have absolutely no doubt that if you said we're going to do Medicare for all, that a legally plausible claim would have been generated and we would have ended up in exactly the same situation of legal limbo and sort of marching up this polarized judicial process.
Well, no, it would have been in limbo for the year or two that it took to let it go through the courts, and then it would have been resolved. And in the resolution, clarity would have been achieved about the limits of federal power, about the meaning of the various relevant clauses in the Constitution, and they would have affected the formulation of policy going forward. That's the way it's always been.
Let me ask you a question.
Again, I don't understand what the objection is to people who feel that an expansion of federal power might exceed the limits duly authorized by the Constitution, bringing their objections into court and letting courts rule.
No, the objection that I have is that the courts entertained specious arguments and gave them greater credit, greater credence than they deserved. This activity versus inactivity.
And my observation is that if those arguments were so specious, how could as you just cited, a plurality of legal experts have thought that they were going to actually prevail at the level of the highest court?
Well, I think by the time it got up to the Supreme Court, people really realized, hey, so we don't. I think, by the way, let me ask you a question. It seems to me that the process of that the political polarization of the judiciary is a real problem, and that it's a problem in terms of public perception, and it's a problem in terms of the reality, where you have people on both sides who are basically vetted because they have a connection they have a political connection to particular actors. They don't have necessarily a visible track record, but there's someone like John Roberts who clearly is coming out of a political world. And when you look at decisions like Citizens United or Bush v. Gore, and you look at what 4 justices were willing to do in this case, which would have been to completely overturn this law, it does seem to me that we have a problem that in a very, very polarized society, that eventually the judiciary is going to be very polarized as well, and that the public will interpret whether I'm right about whether my argument that I just gave you is right. That's what
I'm sorry, Harold. I'm sorry. I hear you. You've had enough time on this one. I think this is sour grapes about what has come to be a conservative court, because the Democrats haven't been able to muster enough time in the Oval Office to be able to appoint enough justices. I remember the confirmation hearing of Robert Bork. I remember it. Okay, so, the judiciary is polarized.
Is there a better way to do this?
That was the book by Stephen Carter, the law professor at Yale University. I think it was written 15 years ago, about how politically polarized the courts have become. The abortion question, a question which in advanced and civilized democracies is decided at the ballot box and not in the judicial chambers, has also lent fuel to this situation. It's a mess. I agree with you that it's a mess, but I don't think it's any more of a mess because the court has now leaned conservative, or that it's a mess that's been created by people of the like of.
Well, what do you think of? What do you think of? Well, no, in fact, I think John Roberts did. I think he did something that was a good thing in backing away from. I think had he overturned the Affordable Care Act, I think it would have been.
Well, we're going to have an election. The election is a matter of months away. What a travesty it would have been if the court had preempted the electorate's ability, repeal and replace Obamacare. That's what the Republicans are running on. The election in 2010 was substantially about that. Certainly the energy on the right was largely engendered by people's objections to this policy development. So if the court had short-circuited the people's ability to either reject or to ratify this very significant innovation in American social policy infrastructure, they would have been overstepping their role and they would have been acting politically. I agree with that 100%. I think John Roberts acted wisely, whether or not these were his motives, in forestalling that development and allowing us to have this election. But we're going to have the election.
Yep.
And as far as I can tell, it's a 51-49 proposition on this particular matter. And the numbers are, it could go either way. I mean, this could be, we didn't want to do horse race, but this could actually be fuel for the fire, fundraising and, grassroots energy for the Republicans.
By the way, I actually think that this is where I realize that things like in-trade are so wrong, because I think had the Affordable Care Act not necessarily been overturned, but had it been deeply damaged and had the mandate been thrown out, I think that would have handed. I think Mitt Romney would have been able to say quite accurately, this is the centerpiece of the Obama presidency. This is what he laid down his chips for in a difficult economy, and it's come to naught, or it's come to it's been a huge disappointment, and it would have been devastating, and I think that
And Obama would have been left around against the court, which would have gotten the base excited, but probably wouldn't have.
No, I don't think so. And I think Romney could just say, "Look, I'm gonna," Romney's basic campaign is pretty obvious. It's basically the economy is terrible. President Obama's been president for a long time, and it's still terrible. And if you ask me any other question, I'll say, well, President Obama's the guy standing there, and the economy is still terrible. And that's, by the way, not a bad campaign strategy.
Well, the economy is tough.
It sure is. That's of course we realize in retrospect that President Franklin Roosevelt had the great fortune to come into office after there had been this long period of terrible economic environment under Herbert Hoover, and a lot of the consequences of the recession, hit early in the Obama years when there wasn't a whole lot he could do about it, and so on. No, I think the 2012 election is so huge. It's certainly huge for health reform. I mean, just imagine, you just replace one Supreme Court justice. And imagine that Ruth Bader Ginsburg is replaced by a conservative. That would have completely changed this case. And I have no doubt that President Romney would have a substantial ability to reverse health reform, partly because the original sin of health reform is how backloaded the really important provisions are that reach the large numbers of people. And I think that was just a fundamental problem that everything that's been implemented so far in health reform, I think would be very hard to overturn. But the 32 million people who need health insurance haven't gotten it yet.
I assume the reason it was backloaded, in the first place was that was the only thing that you could do to get the act.
Yeah, I think that there were a series of
So the ultimate resolution here is going to be in electoral politics, right? And now the president is compelled to run on health care, which he hasn't been saying as much about outside the context of this lawsuit politically, because it has been polling poorly, in which many of the red state Democrats, or Democrats who are in relatively conservative districts, one thinks of Claire McCaskill in Missouri, for example, are saying very little about, and kind of running away from. And I'm just, so here's kind of my question, the kind of thing I hope we could talk a little bit about, which is why is there so much political opposition, and how is this campaign going to develop, or how do you imagine the rhetoric of the campaign developing around health policy issues in light of the fact that, well, now the court has stepped out of the way. And, we've got one guy saying, this is the greatest thing since sliced bread, and finally we made a step in the right direction. And we got the other guy saying that this is the worst thing I've ever seen. In the first day of office, I'm going to turn it back.
I don't know. By the way, I don't know how much public opinion is really going to move on health reform. I certainly think that it, I hope it will move, and I and other people will certainly be giving our reasons for why we think this is a very worthy thing, but I think it's a sort of show me, don't tell me kind of an issue. And I think what will really change people's minds about this is when it becomes part of our daily lives and we see it. And until then, it's a lot of discussion about something that's going to happen. And it's very, especially when people are rightly very cynical about a lot of things that involve government, that's always going to be a tough sell. I do think that many... we live in a conservative country in some ways, and we have this process where the Republicans are very unified in opposition to a very, to health reform, and many Democrats were in a much more ambivalent stance about it and didn't give a forthright defense of it in a way that they could have. And I think that, ironically, many of the moderate Democrats who ran away from it were defeated in 2010, and I wish that they had, they might as well have given a better accounting of themselves and of what was done. I do think that the real reason that that the 2010 election went so badly it was the economy, and that as long as the economy is doing badly, that people are, just how ready are people to listen to an argument about health policy, especially if they already have pretty good insurance. There's some people who say, well, if I lose my job, then I will be helped. But especially if the answer is, well, you'll be helped in 2014. That's just it's a harder sell. Like the House bill, for example, would have done more for people now who lost their jobs. And I think that had we not had the Scott Brown election, and there had been more of a compromise, the final bill wouldn't have been quite as backloaded as what we finally got. That's a long-winded answer.
The Tea Party, the upsurge of the Tea Party and the energy of the Tea Party didn't look to me like it was only about the economy being bad. And Scott Brown's election in Massachusetts didn't look to me like it was only about the economy being bad. But I guess we're going to
I would give the Tea Party a lot of credit, actually. I find their platform abhorrent, but I also think you got to, sometimes you lose a game because the opposing team does a good job. And, the Tea Party people are very, when I compare them to the Occupy movement, I'm sorry I interrupted you, but allow me to, when I compare them to the Occupy movement, I see the Occupy movement as a lot of people who are ambivalent about conventional politics, who are alienated, and who have a bunch of views that are pretty, that I have some sympathy with, but who in their actual political behavior I don't see as particularly effective. When I look at the Tea Party people, I see people who may believe all sorts of things that I find sort of crazy in the substance, but they're extremely effective and extremely energized and engaged in the political process, in the Republican primary process, in the legislative process. And one of the reasons that the Democrats lost in 2010 is that a lot of our people who were personally jazzed about Obama were just more difficult to mobilize and to get out and be politically effective. And I think that you've got to say that I think in Massachusetts, by the way, Scott Brown was just a much better candidate than Martha Coakley, and that matters. And getting your if I think of the Tea Party as a politically engaged group of older white voters who were pretty conservative, I do think that people are not all that thrilled about Barack Hussein Obama, and that there's various ways that makes itself felt. Now, these are people that are really engaged in politics, and Republican politicians are scared to death of the Tea Party because they know that these people are going to be there. How many Democrats feel the same about Occupy? I think not too many.
I mean, where is the more comprehensive ideology or kind of social theory that animates the democratic politics that could be the basis for the building of, long-lasting grassroots populist engagement? I mean, it's an eclipse. I mean, the labor movement as a political force, it's still formidable, but it is a shadow of its former self. And the arguments for it, as the Wisconsin recall effort of the governor out there, I think, has demonstrated, the argument of it just has less appeal to the mind of your centrist voter than it once did. And I'm just wondering what argument replaces it. What I see is a pastiche of various discrete appeals to, women, gays, Latinos.
By the way, you start adding those groups up. There's a lot of people.
What I see is a reluctance. Excuse me. Let me just finish the sentence. What I see is a reluctance to put forward a kind of coherent framework of progressivity and to stand for it in the face of this, right-wing rhetoric about America being an exceptional nation, about, taxes and the job creators and all this kind of stuff. There isn't any, the word socialist is a bad word. If I called somebody, if I thought that they believed that, social, the idea that I could learn something from Europe, European style becomes, so that, and I'll be finished. The view of the world that would be the template around which you would construct a grassroots politics of the left doesn't seem to have a place in the American public culture. And that's why I think that you can get a Tea Party, but that Occupy Wall Street will fizzle.
Well, but I think it's different issues. I think what you're saying is true about some issues and not others. Because I think, for example, many people have commented on the irony that social liberalism is doing very well, while economic progressivism is not doing well. You look at an issue like gay marriage. We all know where that's going. And the Republican Party has a real problem that it's viewed as socially intolerant, and that that if you say, well, if you're not going to get the votes of gay Americans, and you're not going to get the votes of non-Christians, and you're not going to get the votes of immigrants, you start to say the Republicans have a real problem, because the pastiche that you just identified just adds up to a lot of people. And if you think about issues of reproductive rights, for example, those are issues that American attitudes have really shifted. And I think economically, I agree with you. We have a real issue. It's ironic because we're going through such a terribly difficult economic time. You would think, at some level, what could be a better time for economic populism than right now?
I've said it many times myself right here at
it just hasn't.
The deal is going down. Trillions of dollars are being transferred from the little guy to the big guy. The big guy is walking away with not only his money, but his dignity intact. And there's no politics of, revenge. There's no politics of rage. There's no politics of leveling the playing field. The Consumer Finance Protection Agency, whatever it's called, can barely get out of Congress, and you can't even get a director of it.
By the way, why is it, given that you just said that, why are you so offended by the very mild little potshots taken at Mitt Romney over his Bain Capital stuff? It seems to me that's a real contradiction.
Okay, so we don't have time to discuss the Bain Capital issue, but it does come back to the previous conversation, and I'm offended as an economist because I think it's just demagogic. I think rearranging assets is a perfectly respectable thing for people to do. I think if you're in a firm where you're trying to put these kind of deals together and you are able to leverage and make money out of it, there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing evil about that. And I just think this, he's a rich guy, therefore he doesn't get the middle class.
Let's accept that's totally right. It still seems ironic given the the previous paragraph that you spoke, because that's the expression. But I think if liberals do not come up with a good account that deals with rising inequality and so on, that we really will have a lot of junk out there. And some of what's in, I really like some of the things that the people that I identify with Occupy are saying, and I have sort of your reaction to others. We do have, we have to figure out a way that we have a humane market economy and really discuss it. Yeah.
Well, we agree, and I'm going to have to terminate, but I just want to say one thing in answer to your question. The $750 billion that got appropriated in this rescue package to bail out the banks is one thing. Bain Capital, or other people like them, clever people sitting around with their spreadsheets trying to figure out where they can make a hit, come in, turn something around, rearrange it, and make money for their investors is another. I don't equate those things at all. I think that the shareholders ought to have taken a much bigger haircut. And I think that the tentacles of federal power ought to have been much more muscular in preventing too big to fail from happening again. I wouldn't have had a problem with nationalizing some of those institutions. Of course, we would want to divest shortly thereafter. Getting their balance sheets right, and letting the taxpayer and the federal government be kind of the arbiter over how that thing was going to go down. So it seems to me not at all inconsistent at one and the same time to say, I didn't like the Wall Street, Washington Axis resolution of the financial crisis and the power that went on there without any political accountability or very little of it. And at the other hand, say a guy like Mitt Romney, who goes out and makes money in private equity, shouldn't be demonized just because he got rich by being.
But I do want to end on a more optimistic note, because I think we're probably getting pretty close to the end. I actually predict that President Obama is going to limp to re-election. And it's not going to be. It's going to be a ground game. It's not going to be like the sweet experience of 2008, but he will win re-election. In part because if you say why is Mitt Romney not doing better, I think it's because a lot of Americans actually do recognize the bad hand that Obama's been dealt and the way that the Republicans have responded to that. And I think that as we pull out of the recession, that 2 or 3 years from now, we're going to have a very different sense of things. Health reform, I think, not in its aspirational form, but in a very valuable form, will start to make an on-the-ground reality that will help a lot of people. That the bitterness of our politics will be somewhat dissipated. After 2012, and when the unemployment rate is not as catastrophic as it is right now, and then I think we'll start to see. We will have had a black president for several years, with the planet still rotating, and the demographic shifts in American politics will continue. And I predict that, for example, on immigration, that we're going to see some kind of movement on immigration. And I think what the president did on immigration, which, by the way, was also sort of legally, I think he pushed a boundary, but substantively is what we all know has to happen with with these really long-term undocumented young people, that we'll start to see that things will look a lot different than they do right now, and that a lot of the things that President Obama has not done perfectly, or that people are criticizing, people will say, well, he survived it and he accomplished some important stuff, and our society will have moved in a more humane direction. So I'm actually more optimistic than a lot of this conversation might lead one to think.
Why don't we, before the mood shifts, close on that very optimistic note? Your lips to God's ears.
I've heard that phrase like 4 times in the past day when I've made some sort of optimistic prediction. That may be a sign that some of my friends think I'm over-medicated.
Well, I don't see it. At least I don't see it as a high probability development. I mean, we'll see what happens. I think it's a close call.
Faith and evidence of things unseen. What can I tell you?
From this perspective.
Anyway, it's great to talk to you.
Okay, bye-bye. Nice talking to you. Thanks a lot.